On May 19, 2022, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco instructed Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi and ministers of Holy Communion in his diocese that Speaker Pelosi is not to be admitted to Holy Communion. He took this step because after his years-long attempts to engage Speaker Pelosi regarding the exercise of her office in the promotion of grave sin, she remained obstinate in doing so. Specifically at issue is Speaker Pelosi's decades-long active promotion of abortion in defiance of the Church's explicit and perennial teaching that abortion is a grave sin against life in violation of the Fifth Commandment, and that it's a grave sin to promote grave sin. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli for Catholic Studies Academy, and in this video I'll be explaining Archbishop Cordileone's actions and the criticisms leveled against him by those who disagree with him. Stick to the end of this video, and I'll even tell you how you could rise above the fray in the way you think about this controversy, regardless of your personal views about abortion, and even if you aren't Catholic. Now, before we get started, let's not forget the basics. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe buttons, ring the bell, share our content, and if you feel so moved, please support our work by hitting the thanks button to make a direct donation. So, let's get started. Now again, on May 19, 2022, San Francisco Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone published what's called a notification, in which he decreed that Speaker Pelosi is not to present herself for Holy Communion, and if she does, is to be refused, until such time as she publicly repudiates her support for abortion and receives sacramental absolution for that sin. He took this measure in an appeal to Canons 915 and 916 in the Code of Canon Law, the law book of the Catholic Church of the Latin Rite. Canon 915 imposes the duty upon ministers of Holy Communion, that is, those distributing communion to the faithful, to refrain from distributing communion to those who obstinately persevere in manifest grave sin, Speaker Pelosi's objective situation as identified by Archbishop Cordileone in his notification. Canon 916 further imposes the duty upon would-be communicants to refrain from approaching Holy Communion if they're aware of having committed grave sin without having been reconciled to the Church through sacramental confession and, where necessary, the lifting of a formal juridical penalty, which conditions also apply in this case. Canons 915 and 916 concern what theologians and canonists have come to call Eucharistic coherence, that is, conforming the Church's discipline regarding the reception of Holy Communion to the Church's doctrine regarding what the Eucharist is and what receiving communion means. Many among the faithful have lamented over the past several decades that when notorious public sinners are admitted to Holy Communion at Mass, the Church's teaching is undermined. As the saying goes, discipline is doctrine. At a practical level, human psychology being as it is, the way we behave collectively regarding sacred things tells us what we need to know about them. Actions often do speak much louder than words. Scandal occurs here because the message is communicated through the Church's actions, either that the sinner who unhesitatingly approaches Holy Communion and does so without so much as a sideways glance from the minister of communion isn't really sinning at all, or else if the communicant is sinning, that the Eucharist isn't what we say it is, or receiving communion doesn't mean what we say it means. Is abortion really a grave sin, as the Church has taught from ancient times? Is it really a grave sin to promote grave sin, as again the Church has always taught? Was St. Paul right when he wrote to the Corinthians, saying that whoever should eat the bread or should drink the cup of the Lord unworthily will be liable of the body and of the blood of the Lord, will incur the guilt of having desecrated the Eucharist or of having rejected Christ, and so must not approach Holy Communion lest he eat and drink his own condemnation? These are the questions at stake for the Church's public witness on matters of faith and morals in the present case, and a weakening of the sensus fidei in the Church, with its corresponding implications in the concrete ways in which self-identifying Catholics live their lives, would be the fault both of these notorious sinners and of those pastors of the Church who permit them to persevere in grave sin without reproof and to receive Holy Communion unimpeded. It's precisely for this reason that Archbishop Cordileone took the measure he did, as stated in his notification. Indeed, how could Archbishop Cordileone have done otherwise in the face of Speaker Pelosi's recent campaign to see Roe v. Wade codified into federal law in response to recent developments, including a Texas bill that's withstood court challenges and the likely overturning of Roe v. Wade as Supreme Court precedent in the near term, all while justifying her efforts to promote and expand abortion through appeals to her Catholic faith? In doing so, she represents herself not only as a private actor entrusted with a public office, but as a teacher of the Catholic faith. Yet she possesses no ecclesiastical mandate to teach on matters of faith and morals in the name of the Church or with the Church's confidence. And given that she represents a condemned thesis as flowing from Catholic teaching and does so in the public forum, she must be publicly corrected to avoid scandal. Indeed, this is exactly the kind of scandal against which Christ himself had cautioned, saying, "It is impossible for the stumbling blocks, scandala, not to come, but woe to him by whom they come. It is better for him if a millstone is hung around his neck and he is thrown into the sea than that he should cause one of these little ones to stumble." Indeed, after decades of Eucharistic incoherence, in which not just Speaker Pelosi, but many in the public trust who openly and obstinately promote grave evil nonetheless present themselves for Holy Communion and receive it at Mass, we can see very clearly, as I've discussed elsewhere, that American Catholics are, on the whole, thoroughly confused about the Church's most fundamental teachings on matters of faith and morals. The longer it goes on, the worse it gets, and the worse it gets, well, the worse it gets. But no sooner did Archbishop Cordileone issue his pronouncement against Speaker Pelosi than the pundits took to their platforms to denounce him as a political hack intent on dividing the Church rather than uniting it. Noted sacramental theologian and canonist Whoopi Goldberg decided to educate the Archbishop on his role as middle management in a church in which really only the Pope has any actual authority regarding the administration of sacraments and the binding and loosing of sins.
The Archbishop of San Francisco is calling for Speaker Nancy Pelosi to be denied receiving communion because of her pro-choice stance. He's one of the priests who also called for President Biden to be denied sacrament. This is not your job, dude. That is not up to you to make that decision.
Apparently, Ms. Goldberg is a student of 19th century anti-Catholic German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, whose interpretation of the Church's teaching on the office of Peter was condemned as heretical. But in fairness to Ms. Goldberg, that was about 150 years ago under Pope Pius IX. Francis is the Pope now, and he says that the Eucharist isn't the reward of saints, but the bread of sinners. So, obstinately persevering in manifest grave sin, Speaker Pelosi is the ideal communicant. Ms. Goldberg was quoting from Pope Francis' homily at the Feast of Corpus Christi in 2021, and as with most who quote that passage, she was doing so out of context. Francis clearly does think that some people ought not to be admitted to Holy Communion because people have been formally excommunicated from the Church under his watch, and he recently authorized revisions to the Code of Canon Law, expanding the offenses incurring late sententia excommunication to include attempting to ordain a woman or attempting to receive ordination as a woman. If you don't know, late sententia excommunication means that the sentence of excommunication is intrinsic to the offense. A person who does such a thing is a person who's separated himself from the Church. And even in the homily from which Ms. Goldberg quoted, Francis says that you cannot break Sunday's bread if your heart is closed to others. You cannot eat this bread if you do not give the bread to the hungry. You cannot share this bread if you do not share the sufferings of those in need. It's true that his homily emphasizes the need for the Church to draw people in rather than drive them away because Christ came to heal the sick, most of all the spiritually sick, sinners. But didn't Francis just suggest here that there are conditions for approaching Holy Communion, namely that we're conformed to Christ and disposed to others as he is? Now, the Church distinguishes, remember, between mortal or grave sin, by which a person destroys the life of charity in his own soul, as for example by actively promoting abortion, and venial sin, by which a person, weak and imperfect as he is, falls short of the full demands of charity, even as he turns to grace in search of life eternal. That's an important distinction, and when I read that homily, it seems to me that Francis is taking it for granted. So Francis isn't saying that unrepentant sinners should present themselves for Holy Communion, but that having repented, they should approach communion with the hope that God's grace will strengthen them against falling into sin again, and that every time they sin, they should repent and approach communion with this hope and a longing for personal holiness. The point is that you don't entrench yourself in your sin, but with the help of God's grace, seek righteousness. It's the difference between penitence and obstinacy. Remember the thieves on the cross, one of whom was assured of heaven, and the other, well, probably not heaven. Archbishop Cordileone's actions move along this very same trajectory. Once again, he justifies his actions not in response to Speaker Pelosi's general moral imperfection, nor in response to her past mortal sins, or even her private mortal sins, but in response to her obstinate, that is, impenitent, perseverance in manifest or public mortal sin. So no, I don't think Ms. Goldberg can really get from this cherry-picked quote from Pope Francis to an indictment of Archbishop Cordileone. Not only does she fail to understand the Church's teaching on the relationship between bishops and the Pope, but she also fails to understand the homily from which she quotes the Pope. Ms. Goldberg is hardly the only one to offer uninformed commentary on these events, however. When this sort of thing comes up, and rare as it may be, this isn't the first time, the typical move is to accuse the pastors of the Church of a form of Eucharistic desecration by reducing the Eucharist to a political weapon. That charge, however, is shamefully disingenuous and one-sided. It's disingenuous because for Catholics, at issue in the question of abortion isn't a matter of practical political policy, but an unjustifiable homicide, the kind of evil political communities exist to prevent and to punish. You may or may not agree with that understanding of what abortion is, but here we're dealing with an internal church matter, and the Catholic Church does understand abortion in that way. So what we have in this case is a pastor of the Church imposing an injunction with respect to a political figure who's a registered member of his flock as regards her public and obstinate promotion through the exercise of her office of what church teaching identifies as unjustifiable homicide. The issue isn't about politics, but about the Church's perennial teaching on matters of faith and morals, which happens to carry with it certain political implications. Nevertheless, in ignorance or else willful disregard of this fact, the editorial board of the San Francisco Examiner, imagining themselves, it seems, to oversee the publication of a newspaper known throughout the Catholic world for its erudite coverage of stories touching directly on matters of Catholic doctrine regarding faith and morals, published an op-ed in which they accused Archbishop Cordileone of dividing rather than uniting. Exhibiting an astounding absence of critical thinking skills, the authors fail to recognize that the issue here revolves around an irreconcilable difference, a fundamental contradiction between what Speaker Pelosi believes about abortion and what the Catholic Church teaches about it. So when they accuse Archbishop Cordileone of fomenting division, they're really only taking sides in a pre-existing divide and saying that the Church's objective teaching on this matter should be abandoned. If, as the Church teaches, abortion is an unjustifiable homicide and as such is always and everywhere wrong, then there aren't any conditions under which it could be promoted as a good. That's what the terms unjustifiable and always and everywhere wrong mean. But Speaker Pelosi does promote abortion as a social good and asserts that doing so is a morally good act. What's more, she's not just advocating political tolerance for an evil she thinks the state can't police without itself perpetrating still greater evils in the process. She's far to the left of the general populace on this question, as is nearly everyone in a leadership position in her party. Speaker Pelosi resists every attempt to limit abortion at any stage of gestation for any reason, a view ubiquitous among her party's political class but shared by less than 20% of the general population. And she advocates for making abortion as widely available as it could possibly be at taxpayer expense. It's sociologically impossible to be more pro-abortion than she is. She sees abortion as something essential for a civil society and positively good for the individuals who procure them. The Church, by contrast, sees abortion as something destructive of the social fabric, as gravely evil, contrary to nature, and corrosive of the most primal of interpersonal relationships. There simply is no common ground between these two views. They're separated by a chasm. Division, in other words, already exists. The editorial board at the San Francisco Examiner just has a particular solution in mind for healing that division, and it's the opposite of the Church's traditional approach to heresy and sin. Where Archbishop Cordileone invites Speaker Pelosi to convert and to conform her moral views to the objective moral teaching of the Catholic Church, the San Francisco Examiner wants Archbishop Cordileone to go away or to be expelled from his diocese by a pope they perceive as aligned to their agenda, who would replace Archbishop Cordileone with a bishop willing to conform the Church's teaching to Speaker Pelosi's moral views and to theirs, which are the views of the fallen world. Once again, the authors make their argument by an embarrassing appeal to a false middle management model of church governance, and more than one out-of-context quote from Pope Francis. In keeping with their Nietzschean will-to-power, postmodernist, progressivist ideology, the editorial board at the San Francisco Examiner say that the Pope should make a power play by sending, quote, a clear message that he, not Cordileone, is the leader of the faith, and relieving this insubordinate saboteur of his duties in San Francisco and putting an end to his political schemes. Not only then do they reference the bread of sinners quote from Pope Francis' 2021 Corpus Christi homily, but they also reach back to his "Who am I to judge?" remark from his July 2013 mid-air interview. I realize, of course, that we've entered a hopelessly polemical age in which huge segments of the populace have become incapable of critical thought, but humor me. If you remember the context in which Francis made that remark, he was talking about a repentant private sinner, not an obstinate public sinner. The difference should be obvious. On the plane, he was asked about people who struggle with same-sex attraction, perhaps even in the priesthood, and have fallen into sin and sought repentance. His response had nothing to do with what the Church teaches on sexual morality, but instead how we ought to deal with people who, having succumbed to temptation, repent and seek a way back to the life of grace. Francis actually clarified his remarks in detail in his book, The Name of God is Mercy, where he makes it clear that he's not saying homosexual acts aren't sinful, but that God is merciful to repentant sinners, and Christians have an obligation to honor God's mercy, to facilitate it, and to accept its concrete implications. Francis' view, in other words, was that we should be ready to forgive and to move on, and not to make one's past failings an issue going forward. So what's the logic according to which the Church deals with sinful human beings who, recognizing their faults, turn back to God and seek to be conformed to his ways and healed by his grace? We forgive. We put our arms around them and say, come on, let's go home. But that's not the case with Speaker Pelosi, and so Francis' remarks don't apply in this context. Who am I to judge? Archbishop Cordileone has every right to respond, I'm the Archbishop of San Francisco, the one to whom St. Paul poses the challenge. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? Do you not know that we will judge angels? So indeed, set up for your judgment the ones in the Church being cast out as nullified. For all the talk from the world about the Church staying out of secular affairs and politics, perhaps it's time for a reminder that the world ought to stay out of the affairs of the Church. The issue moves in both directions. Christians, of course, are human beings too, and we live and work within the same physical sphere as everyone else. So, whatever our station in life or rank in the Church, Christians should be concerned about practical, political, social, and economic questions. But these are complicated issues, and there's nothing in Revelation about how exactly to employ contemporary technologies in the present political and legal context to address them. The pastors of the Church, by virtue of their office, enjoy no special competency when it comes to such things, and to that extent I agree with those who say that the Church should stay out of politics and secular affairs. But it's always going to be difficult for the pastors of the Church to navigate that boundary, because everything human beings do has some moral significance and relates in some way to our last end. And the moral significance of human action in relation to the ultimate purpose of human existence is a central concern of the Church and a subject of her special competency. The Church can and must speak to issues in that sphere. The breakdown occurs when church officials move from discussing the fundamental questions like what kinds of acts are in principle immoral, or what it means for a human being to be good, or what the fundamental purpose of the political community is for human flourishing, to policy questions regarding how best to secure the true good of the human person and the human community at a practical level, or what sorts of policies appear most likely to secure the most good for the whole community with the fewest and most manageable downsides. The pastors of the church are as entitled as anyone else to hold their views on those matters and even to speak about them, but they shouldn't presume to teach about them, and they should never take umbrage with a lay member of the faithful for holding a different view on the same question. Why not? Because while these views touch on questions of concern to the church, they aren't and can't be matters of faith. And even though the church teaches infallibly on related questions, these questions deal with extrapolations derived from those truths and other data known only imperfectly from finite and fallible human reason, mixed even then with anyone's best guess about what might happen if we do one thing rather than another. Objective Catholic doctrine concerning the divine and natural law is one thing, but subjective political or economic opinion is something else entirely, and however infallible the Church's objective teaching on faith and morals may be, nothing privileges a bishop's subjective opinions on practical matters over those of anyone else. Once again, the Church does possess special competency in the natural moral law, and on that basis possesses by divine right the authority and the duty to intervene in practical, social, economic, and political affairs. Nevertheless, that competency meets its limit at the sort of question for which no universal answer can be given, but only one conditioned to time and place and circumstance, its answers subject to working hypotheses or to trial and error. That, by the way, is objective Catholic teaching. It's what Popes Pius XII and John Paul II meant when they responded to heated debates of their time, not with definitive locutions ending the controversy, but with deference to those closest to the problems, saying that the Church doesn't make technical judgments. Now, if you ask Speaker Pelosi, that's exactly the move that Archbishop Cordileone is making in his notification, and so she regards his action as illegitimate. But she's wrong. Cordileone's action doesn't involve extrapolation about complex sociopolitical interactions, and it doesn't rely on imperfect modes of knowing, but on the objective moral law given in nature to all human beings and in a purified way through divine revelation. So, is abortion unjustifiable homicide and the sort of injustice the political community exists to prevent and to punish, or is it not? The Church says it is, and yet Speaker Pelosi promotes it. Archbishop Cordileone is operating well within the proper bounds of his office and well within the special competency of the Church to give this direction regarding her access to the Blessed Sacrament on that account. He's doing his duty to God, to the Church, and to a wayward member of his flock who, should she persevere on her present course until death, is, according to Catholic teaching, very likely to face damnation. For Archbishop Cordileone to allow Speaker Pelosi to continue on that path without reproof or perceptible consequence, and thus to end her earthly pilgrimage in the ruin of her soul, would be a dereliction for which he himself would be held to account before the judgment seat of God. So, Catholic or not, as a reasonable person, you should be able to understand what's really going on here, and even if you don't agree with what the Church teaches about abortion or about itself, you should at least be able to respect the fact that because Archbishop Cordileone does believe, he's probably not acting out of malice or out of political motivations, but in response to a moral and religious imperative. So, there you have it. Those are my thoughts on this matter. Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and if you haven't done so already, hit the like and subscribe button, ring the bell, share our content, and if you feel so moved, please support our work by hitting the thanks button to make a direct donation. Doing so helps us reach a broader audience and, hopefully, lead more souls to heaven. Once again, I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli for Catholic Studies Academy. Thanks for watching.